If you've had the supreme displeasure of having watched any US politician speak about anything ever, you've no doubt heard the phrase middle class. But what does that actually mean? Aside from some vague notion of me, I guess, the term can be notoriously difficult to define. Wikipedia claims that the middle class is either, quote, the middle fifth of individuals on a nation's income ladder, or, quote, everyone but the poorest and wealthiest 20%. The Economist characterized the middle class as, quote, having a reasonable amount of discretionary income, and, quote, beginning at the point where people have roughly a third of their income left for discretionary spending after paying for basic food and shelter. Well, there's our answer, right? Actually seems pretty clear-cut. Well, if you were to use the Pew Research Center's handy-dandy "Are you in the American middle class income calculator?" Sorry everyone else on Earth, this one's for the Americans. It says that I am a member of the middle class, but I can tell you definitively that I don't have a third of my income left after paying my bills. More like 10%. And as I'm sure many of you can attest, that's a lot of discretionary income compared to most Americans, many of whom can't even pay their bills without going into credit card debt. So what gives? Well, maybe looking at the origin of the term will enlighten us. One of the first places this term appears is in James Bradshaw's 1745 banger, "A Scheme to Prevent the Running of Irish Wolves to France." In this certified hood classic, Jimmy Boy identifies the classes as such, quote, "As riches beget ease and luxury, so as the country of Ireland was improved, their people grew more pompous in dress, more expensive in equipage. The lower class, who were formerly well dressed in ratines and frises, despite that clothing now, and purchase cloths mixed with Spanish wools. And the middle class, together with their nobility and gentry, wear no cloths but such as are manufactured of all Spanish wools." Nothing could be more clear. The middle class is, of course, a class of people that are not nobility, but still wear the most dastardly of all fabrics, wool made from Spanish sheep. The Spanish wool industry is single-handedly cucking Western Europe, and it must be stopped. As ridiculous as this might sound, this view of the middle class is not too far off. Let me explain. So obviously, the term middle class refers to a group of people with some amount of disposable income, and always has. Whether it's the Economist's wildly optimistic metric of 1/3 of an individual's income being classified as discretionary, or those pompous Irish dressing in exotic Spanish wool. You might notice though that the quote middle class that Jimbo here is talking about isn't highly paid tech bros that work for Google wasting their money on one-wheel scooters and JPEGs of monkeys with grills. In fact, the people that made up this middle class aren't even workers at all. Let's back up. When this term emerged, Europe and their colonies were ruled almost to the man, yes man, by kings, dukes, emperors, and so on. It was a very small class of impossibly rich autocrats who got their power because 1, God says so, and 2, I'm gonna cut your head off if you disagree. This class, the aristocracy, is one we all know and rightfully despise in civilized countries. And below this aristocracy were the dirty, unwashed peasants, who grew all the food, fought in all the wars, and more or less kept society going, all while suffering the absolute worst of what this society had to offer. This class made up the vast majority of people. But between these two classes, in the middle, if you will, was another relatively small class of merchants that lived in cities, and were making more and more money as their kings and queens pillaged the rest of the world. In what would become Germany, this middle class was referred to as the burghers, but you're probably more familiar with the French term, bourgeoisie. Yes, the term the middle class emerged to refer to that class of detestable pig dogs that own the means of production, while hiring others to perform the actual labor, the owning class, the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks of 18th century England. At this point, the class was a relatively minor influence on the world, but that would unfortunately not last. Yes, the perpetually oppressed Spanish wool-wearing, incredibly wealthy owners of incredibly wealthy owners of global trade companies and the like rose up against the nobility and came to rule their societies. We in the biz like to call this the transition from the feudal system to the liberal capitalist system. In this new world, the highest offices of the land were occupied not by hereditary kings, but by rich business owners that worked their way up from nothing by inheriting their parents' companies and or getting a small loan of $1 million from wealthy family members. This money they then invested in companies and ventures that they thought would make them money by following the holy scripture of the profit incentive. But they didn't actually do the work. They paid other people for that, sold whatever goods they were producing at a markup, and pocketed the difference. Profit, passive income, grind set baby. Now, having just removed the aristocracy from power in all civilized countries, the owning class was the ruling class, so the term middle class no longer really applied. In this brave new world, there were broadly speaking two kinds of people, the aforementioned owning class and the people that they paid to do the work at their companies. You're not going to believe it, but this one's called the working class. These people, who were mostly peasants under feudalism, had moved to their cities since the advent of capitalism thanks to these fantastic new policies like the enclosure of the commons that made it illegal to use the land in the countryside that they'd been using for agriculture and grazing for centuries. So, in order to pay for their selfish, extravagant wants like a bed to sleep in and food to eat, they had no other option but to sell their time and energy to the big kahunas that owned all the things and stuff. As you might guess, the working class wasn't super thrilled about this arrangement of power, and so they started coming together in unions, parties, and community organizations that advocated for their interests. At first, this issue was something the owning class could solve by paying thugs to do breathtaking violence on strikers and children. This took the form of mercenaries, like the Pinkertons, and also the creation of homegrown standing militaries designed solely for use on the populace to protect property rights. The police. When that fake military got overwhelmed, though, they could always turn to the actual military.
Like they did
in the first and only time bombs were dropped on American soil at the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921. Long story short, the miners at Blair Mountain were on strike, and the American military sent in planes to literally and actually drop bombs on the miners. Land of the free, home of the brave, as long as you're rich or poor and quiet about it at least. For some bamboozling reason, open violence against them only made the working class more upset, and so it was time to switch tack. Enter Henry Ford, classic American businessman, pioneer of the 5-day work week, the owner of the company that created the assembly line, extreme anti-Semite, and a literal credited inspiration for Adolf Hitler. Hank was running the numbers on this brand spanking new economic system, and it seemed that if most of the world is in the working class, and the working class is paid as little as they can get away with in order to maximize profit for the owning class, then there would be nobody to buy the useless trinkets that they spent all their time making. Well, he really couldn't care less about how this impacted the rest of the world. He saw that this slump in sales would lead to, and I don't mean to scare you here, but it just has to be said, a drop in profits. Clearly, something must be done. While the logical conclusion here would be to do what was done with the previous system, to destroy it and create a new one with the interests of the working class in mind, that solution would lead to Ford losing his ridiculous amounts of wealth and no longer being able to own a newspaper that was consumed widely throughout Germany in the years leading up to World War II, and widely published extreme anti-Semitic rhetoric, like so much that he had to eventually get rid of it because of the sheer volume of lawsuits. He was a real pioneer, so he decided to merely tweak the system to his benefit rather than destroy it. To that end, Ford pioneered the concept of, quote, Fordism, a way of orienting the Ford Motor Company that maximized profit growth, not simply by extracting surplus value from the workers that build the cars, but by selling weapons during wartime, plundering the global south, and most importantly, creating a self-sustaining consumer base of relatively high-paid white male American workers that would then have enough money to turn around and buy the things that they made. Put more simply, by slightly shrinking profit margins in the short term to pay higher wages, Ford was putting just a little bit of disposable income as a treat in the pockets of hundreds of thousands of workers. These workers would then in turn give Ford their money back to buy his company's products, and Hank's profits would continue to grow year after year. This was the beginning of the middle class as we refer to it today. Let's pause for a sec. It's now 8 minutes into the video entitled, What is Class? And I have said the word class 42 times, but I have yet to give you a real definition. So far, it sounds like class refers to how much money and influence a group of people has, but that definition breaks down as we go farther into the past. Yeah, the King of England in 1200 probably had more money than the average peasant, bold claim I know, and certainly more influence, but peasants weren't paid in money, and they didn't pay taxes in money. Money existed, don't get me wrong, but most people didn't use it for economic transactions. Do you know what they did use? Work. Labor hours, if you want to be crusty. Every peasant was required to give a certain amount of labor hours to their lord every year at certain times, particularly around harvest time. Among each other, peasants mostly traded goods and services on credit in return for the promise of some return in the future. For the most part, money was reserved for traders and occasionally royals. So, to create a definition of class that makes sense both in England in 1200 and also in the US in 2023, we're gonna have to look at work. With that in mind, we can refer to distinct classes with clear boundaries based not on how much stuff they have, but how they get that stuff. Do you work for a living? Then you are in the working class. Do you get your living from the dividends that you receive from being the owner of a company? Then you are in the owning class. Simple as. But maybe too simple. Clearly, there is a big difference between a CIA director living in Richmond in a $3 million mansion that makes his money by murdering brown people on the other side of the world, and the person barely able to pay rent by working the cash register down the street at the local fast food joint. Yes, there is of course an unequal dynamic there, but they are still both workers. What I'm saying is that there are subclasses within this wider view of the working class. The CIA director belongs to what crusty people like to refer to as the labor aristocracy, a subclass of the working class that is paid extremely well compared to other workers, but still nonetheless get paid for performing labor, basically highly paid workers. But people like this are only half of the so-called labor aristocracy. Here's where it gets a little complicated. So the labor aristocracy can be split in two, with one half falling on the working class side and the other falling on the owning class side. Let's look at an example. So here we've got two people in the American labor aristocracy. We've got Sylvia, who works as a marketing director for a major law firm in Chicago, and we've got Mitch, who runs his own roofing company out of his garage in Little Rock. Both Sylvia and Mitch belong to the labor aristocracy due to their relatively comfortable economic positions, but Sylvia has no ownership over the company she works for. Mitch does, but in terms of net income, he only makes a similar amount of money to Sylvia, or actually probably less when accounting for the local cost of living. But importantly, both of them have a decent amount of discretionary income left over after paying their bills. Mitch, being a small business owner that works at his business with either no employees or at most a handful, can be more accurately described in crusty terms as petite bourgeois, or in American, a small business owner. Sylvia, on the other hand, would be described in the utmost crustiest of terms as, quote, proletarian intelligentsia. This is simply a disgustingly French way of saying that she works for a living, proletarian, and does so in a highly paid, quote, white-collar capacity, intelligentsia. These two demographics make up the labor aristocracy in crusty terms, or the middle class in less accurate terms. These are the people that politicians are talking about when they say that they're working for the middle class, not Chris flipping burgers down the street. And you can see it in the two-party system. Just based on the description of their name, hometown, and occupation, what party do you think Mitch voted for in the last presidential election? Clearly the Republicans, right? And who do you think Sylvia voted for? I mean, she's a woman that lives in Chicago, the stomping grounds of Obama himself. Of course she voted Democrat. Both parties advertise themselves to two different aspects of the American labor aristocracy, all while quietly serving the interests of their billionaire backers. Nobody cares about what the most marginalized workers think. Nobody is working to improve the conditions of the burger flipper whose body is falling apart at age 32 because they don't have health insurance. Nobody is advocating for the Uber driver who works 100 hours a week just to have enough money to feed their children. That wouldn't be profitable. But the fundamental, disgusting inequity of our political and economic system aside, here's a question for you. Where do you think the money that would eventually go into the pockets of Mitch and Sylvia comes from? Did you think that the owning class would merely slash their own profits for that? No. The holy scripture of the profit incentive would never allow for such nonsense. Line must go up on threat of death. Snap back to Nasty Man Ford. He didn't just have plants in the US. He spent years and millions of dollars establishing factories and plantations across the planet. One of these was in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon and was established to grow latex for the tires used on Ford cars. Many Brazilians worked on this plantation, enduring positively inhumane schedules, working through the heat of the day in the middle of the Amazon to harvest latex. These workers made 37 cents a day, were prohibited from possessing alcohol, tobacco, and even soccer balls in their own homes, and forced to eat the diet that Ford himself decided was best for them. An absolutely classic diet with a focus on brown rice and whole wheat breads. Yum. Now, while Fordlandia was itself a horrible failure, due in part to the ineptitude of management and partly due to employee uprisings that became such a threat to Ford's power that he eventually nudged the Brazilian government into sending in the military, the model of shipping the worst parts of capitalism to other countries while making concessions to the workers in the US was a massive hit. More and more, the difficult, demeaning, and demanding jobs that were found in industrial and resource harvesting settings like car assembly and mining were outsourced to countries in the third world, while the American and European working classes began to transition into the comparatively tolerable jobs in middle management and in the service industry. Meanwhile, many major companies based in the US has had at least one slave labor scandal, almost always in Africa, Latin America, or the other parts of the world at the mercy of the US military. So, returning to the question at hand, what is middle class? Well, the middle class is the most well-off of the working class and the least well-off of the owning class. These workers, in the US and Europe mostly, have been given concessions by the owning class of their company in return for allowing those owners to exploit the working class in other countries harder. This is achieved in one of two ways, either by giving workers in one country cushier positions and higher pay, in the case of the proletarian intelligentsia, or by allowing workers to escape the working class and start small businesses and self-employed contracting companies in the tangential markets that are formed by the proletarian intelligentsia spending their excess money. Simple as. Does this mean that the first world workers are responsible for the oppression of workers in the other parts of the world? Well, it doesn't really matter where the blame lies, in my opinion. The objective result is the same: using unequal economic access to exacerbate the division of the working class along arbitrary national and ethnic lines so as to neuter collective action. And the solution is also the same, with the entire working class transcending these boundaries, coming together and building a society that meets everyone's needs, and not just the needs of the absurdly wealthy. But if you pressed me, my answer would be no. The owning class created this system. The owning class benefits most from this system. The owning class perpetuates this system with institutional violence against the downtrodden, and the owning class shoulders the responsibility for their own actions. That said, we are also responsible for our own actions, and if we sit idly by and participate blindly in this system, while we may not be responsible for the existence of such a system, we are complicit. Agitate, educate, organize. Thanks for watching. Further reading is linked in the description, along with links to more detailed videos about Fordlandia, the history of the police, the Battle of Blair Mountain, and all the other things I ended up cutting for time. If you liked this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. If you didn't, please leave me a comment berating me for having the gall to disagree with your programming. Bye.